So the Godot game that I'm working on already has some explosions in it. I followed some YouTube tutorials and made these here explosions, but I'm working on putting some bigger ships in my game, and those big ships deserve some big explosions. Now, from the very beginning, this project has been inspired by House of the Dying Sun. So here are some clips of some explosions from House of the Dying Sun. I love the look of these. I'd like something like this for my own game. And I was thinking that I could do some kind of cool effect, kind of like Malcolm in the Middle did here.
How do we know which one's a Komodo 3000?
Did it say when our vision would come back?
Here's what I ended up achieving. I'm pretty happy with it, and I'm going to show you how I did it. This project is available on GitHub. I'll post a link in the video description and in a pinned comment. I used two images from the Kenny particle pack, the flare and the ring. My massive explosion scene has a root node that's a node 2D, and then I've got two sprite 3Ds for the ring and flare images, and then I've got a GPU particles 3D and a timer. But the script itself is also doing some really cool stuff with the world environment. I'm actually modifying the brightness, contrast, and saturation with some tweens. So I've got some constants right here for how I'm scaling up and then back down to the baseline, the brightness, contrast, and saturation. I've got some variables for the duration that I'm using. And I've got some other variables, and I'll come back to those in a second. But let's just talk about the environment for a moment. So in my ready method, I connect to a signal on this global events bus for whenever an environment gets set. So for example, in my little testing scene, I've got a world environment variable right here. And in my level script, which every single level that I instantiate extends this script. I mean, there's actually hardly anything to it right now. It's just I'm setting a global environment variable, and I'm emitting a signal that that variable was set. And this is great because this lets my massive explosion script reference those environment values. Now, the first thing that happens when the environment gets set is that I want to create a backup of what are the baseline values for the brightness, the contrast, and the saturation, because I don't want those to like shift if multiple explosions go off simultaneously. I don't want to have the explosion say like, oh, what's the brightness right now? And if it's in the middle of some other explosion that's modifying the brightness, then it'll get the wrong idea of what the baseline is. So anyway, that's how I solved that issue. There are certainly other ways to solve it. And finally, let's go down to the play method that actually executes this explosion. I'm going to go through this in detail, but first of all, I want to talk about how the environment is modified. So I have three calls to this function I wrote called blink environment, where I don't know, my phrase for it is blinking various values about the environment. I'm just changing some of the values. And the inputs to this function are specifying what's getting changed. The factor by which I change the, for example, brightness depends on the angle of the camera to the thing that's exploding. So if you're looking at it from the side, like if it's just on the edge of the screen, the brightness is not going to be as affected as if you're staring right at it in the middle of the screen. In fact, if the angle is low enough, really the screen just sort of whites out and you can't see anything. But that's the way I want it for now. And you know, there's all kinds of adjustments one might make for personal preference here. But anyway, I call this single function and I modify brightness, contrast, and saturation. Let's check out that function itself, scrolling on down. And here it is, and I did kind of make it generic so it works with whatever attribute I'm changing. I just give the name of the attribute, like the brightness, the saturation, the contrast. I have the baseline value, I have the factor by which it's going to be modified, and then I have the duration over which it's going to be modified with some default values that I will typically be overriding. I create a tween. I get a reference to the attribute that I'm interested in changing from the environment. I ask the tween to modify the environment for that attribute by the current value times the factor for whatever duration I want. I played around with what sort of transitions and eases looked good to me. I eventually settled on these. Obviously, you can change those. And then I do the same thing with a tween, with the same tween, but going back to the baseline value. And again, I messed with the transitions and eases. I felt like this was good. I wanted this transition in to be sharp and quick, and the transition out to be a little bit more gradual. And I've got some links to some resources that I looked up to get an idea of what these different transitions and eases do. And that's really it in terms of how I'm modifying the environment. I think modifying the environment really gives that little extra bit, that change to the brightness. I really love especially changing the saturation and drawing all the colors out of the world and making it kind of gray for a second. I really think that makes it feel like your eyes are adjusting to this bright light that you just saw. I'm not sure that the contrast really needs to be fiddled with. This is not perfect by any means. A lot of it is me just learning and experimenting and seeing what works. So scrolling back up to the play method here that just sort of executes the explosion. Yeah, I'm not really sure that nope, that's the saturation. That's a good one. I really like that. And I lower the saturation, by the way, so that it becomes like a black and white and gray world, and all the colors go out of it when that explosion flashes. And the saturation, that low saturation, lingers for some time. I'm not sure the contrast really needs adjusted as much, or I'm not sure it even needs adjusted in the way that I did it, but I left the code in here, and you can check that out. Play is the function that I call on the massive explosion. You do need to also position it, like you need to set its global position where it's located, then call play on it. I have a system where I recycle my massive explosions. I just, make them invisible when they're done, and then relocate them and replay them if they ever happen again. They don't have anything tangible that they're doing in the world. They don't have any area 3Ds or collision or anything like that, so this is a fine thing to do. The play method first gets a reference to the camera, figures out the distance to the camera, is going to use that to position the images, because my images are just two-dimensional flat images that I'm going to put in front of the camera. I'm going to put the images between the camera and the thing that is exploding. So these are two functions that I'll get to right after I get through the play method that I just call. One of them is for the flare image, one of them is for the ring image. I get the angle from the camera to the thing that exploded, and I want to use this to scale up or scale down the amount that the environment variables, brightness, contrast, and saturation change. And then lastly, I tell the GPU particles to start emitting, and they're just a one-time, they just emit and then they stop emitting. I note that the effect is currently live, and then I start the timer. The reason for this is that I don't want to, because I am recycling my massive explosions, if another explosion starts before this one is finished, I want to make sure that I don't interrupt this one. I go get some other explosion that's finished. So my timer is just going to be a way of notifying the program that this entire sequence of animations, explosions, is finished animating. And yes, that does suggest that maybe I should just be using an animation player this entire time, and that may be. I did have a version that used the animation player, and it might just be my discomfort still with animation players, but this is how I'm doing it. And hopefully you can still learn some other stuff even if I'm an amateur at the animation player. Great, so let's see what I do with the flare explosion and the ring explosion. I am going to change the transparency of these explosions, and I want to make sure, since I am reusing these explosions, that I want to set it back up to fully opaque, not transparent. I'm going to get the direction from the camera to the thing that is exploding, because that's going to be important in where I put my image. I have this calculation for what is the ideal distance that I want my image to appear at, and I've got some parameters that I'm using. They're set at the top of the script. They're just some variables. Those were experimentally determined of what I thought looked good for the size of the image, and so it didn't look pixelated, and so you could still see it, and all that good stuff. I tell that Sprite 3D where it should be located. I start at the camera position, I go in the direction of the thing that's exploding, and how far do I go in that direction? Well, I go ideal distance, which is just this calculation I made right here. It's just a float. I make sure the explosion is facing the camera using look at right here. I know that I could just go into Sprite 3D and set that it's always facing the camera in its parameters, but the reason I chose to do this is because I also decided to rotate the sprite a little bit. Well, and also because I found that when I first used look at, the backside of the sprite somehow faced the camera. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe something about how I loaded it in. So I first needed to rotate it 180 degrees, or pi radians. And then I also added a minor random rotation to the sprite because I thought the variety there was just kind of nice. And I just, fiddled around. I felt like this was a good range. And I tried rotating Z, but I think X was the good rotation. It just looked good, right? I just decided based on messing around with it. Got to make sure the sprite is actually visible. Create a tween, and I'm just going to have it fade out. I'm just going to modify the transparency so that it fades out over time. And the ring explosion function is going to be similar in a lot of ways. Okay, let's reset the transparency to not transparent. Let's reset the scale, because the ring is actually going to expand outward from the explosion. I think that's kind of a cool effect. So I'm going to reset it to just scale 1, and then more similar stuff is going to happen. Get the direction from the camera to the thing that exploded, figure out what distance you want to put the image at, put the image at that distance, rotate the image to look at the camera, rotate it another 180 because for some reason it puts its backside to the camera. And then I add in some more just random rotations on the ring. This is a lot of randomness, and sometimes it makes it so that the ring is almost invisible, or it's like viewed from nearly side on and it's actually flat, so you can't actually see the thickness of it because it doesn't have a thickness. Yeah, that happens. Maybe I need to fiddle with these values a little bit. I did not make them all from negative 180 to 180, right? This one's only from negative 90 to 90. No, I'm sorry. This is negative 45. I shouldn't convert radians to degrees in my head. I should be able to. But in any case, these are just sort of experimentally determined values. Maybe I should make them parameters that I put at the top of the script. But for now, I'm just leaving them here. And then I change the scale of the ring to this starting value, this very small starting value that I've determined. This is an attribute, just a parameter at the top of the script. Make sure the ring is visible, and then I tween, and I'm going to do some things in parallel. I am both going to change the transparency down to, it's actually not 0, it's nearly 0 though, and you could just use 0. I'm not sure why I used something different. I think it just looked better to me. And then I also modify the scale with the tween, and I do want those to be in parallel at the same time, so I set that. And that's it. That's my massive explosion. Again, I think it looks great. Just to sort of summarize, I modify environment variables for brightness, contrast, and saturation. Not sure all those are really needed. I feel like the brightness and the saturation are the heavy lifters there. I have 2 images, a flare image, which is sort of the visual of the explosion, and an expanding ring going outward from the explosion. And then lastly, I have some GPU particles, which are just those little firefly effects. That's why I actually named them firefly, of like matter that's burning up and slowly fizzling out in the location where the ship was that it exploded. I didn't get into some of the details. The firefly particles are actually emitted in a cube or a rectangular prism shape, and I have those parameters set up for the biggest capital ship that I've created. I have the idea that I might scale these down for some of the smaller ships. I'm not quite sure how I want to do that yet, but for now, I was just really excited to put together this demo of multiple explosion aspects all sort of layered on top of each other, and I succeeded at making it look the way I wanted it to look. And all this code, again, is available on GitHub. If you're looking for the particular scene and script that I'm discussing here, the scene is massive_explosion, and the script is massive_explosion.gd. And I believe they're just in the scenes and scripts folders. No, they're not. So I have the scene in assets particles, and I have the script in scripts VFX special effects, specific effects, massive explosion. My folder system probably needs revised at some point. But hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it, and good luck in your own projects. Bye, folks.
Did it say when our vision would come back?